Hey guys, Coach Pop here. Thanks for joining me for today's video cast. Today we're looking at Western Europe, which in the context of world history, this is the post-classical period. In the context of the history of Western Europe, this is frequently referred to as the Middle Ages, which is divided up or subdivided into three separate periods. This introduces an idea we're going to come back to at the end of the semester of historiography, how you write history. So, if we follow the historiography of Europe from its perspective as opposed to a global perspective, these are the three categories. And I'm going to kind of follow along more or less along those lines for this particular presentation, beginning with the early Middle Ages, which for a long time was referred to as the Dark Ages. Uh, that is a questionable term to be sure, but it's nonetheless one that was very popular and remains popular to this day. But you will remember that the Western Roman Empire was under pressure from all of these Germanic migrations. The Romans considered them invasions, but they're scrambling around all over the place trying to figure out how they can exist once the Huns move in from Central Asia. Everything is scrambled in Western Europe. But after the fall of Rome, the city of Rome itself, what we find is a bunch of Germanic successor states. And what emerges is what I call a hybrid civilization. It's a combination of Roman and Germanic traditions and ideas. In terms of the agricultural base for any civilization, though, there is a fundamental change. At the end of the Roman Empire in the West, the latifundia system was prominent. That is where a very few rich families own almost all of the land, and the latifundia were essentially plantations, and they required much more and more slave labor to work them, but they were also producing crops for export. That is to say, they were producing food to sell it to somebody else for a profit. On the other hand, after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, the Germanic states are much more concerned with subsistence farming. Subsistence farming meaning you're farming enough for you and your family just to survive. That's a fundamental shift. Politically, there's a shift too from the centralized form of government of the Roman Empire and the provincial system to a system where Germanic kings are ruling their own territories. And you've got a bunch of them all claiming to rule over particular territories. Similarly, whereas in the Roman Empire in general, the law was seen to be the supreme commandment, if you will, for organizing their political state. In the Germanic system, warrior chieftains were the norm, and so these warrior chieftains are they have their power because of charisma, but they're giving that because they are spreading the booty from their wars. The spoils of war, if you will, are spread among those who follow him, and that provides the legitimacy for his rule. But it's a little bit different situation when they're no longer necessarily conquering other people, but trying to consolidate. That leads to some problems there. In response to those problems, there are attempts to centralize. We'll see two examples where an attempt is made to create a Holy Roman Empire, to try to recreate that strong centralized state that existed in the Roman Empire. And neither of them are particularly successful. One in particular is short lived, the other one lasts longer, but it never really actually re, replicates what happened in Rome. The first of these appears with the kingdom of the Franks. Now, a couple of people to know include King Clovis. He was the king of the Franks who repelled an attack by the Huns, and he sort of consolidated an area in what we will now call France. Another guy to know is Charles Martel. He repelled the Umayyads at the Battle of Tours. And I had mentioned this last week, but for a while it looked as if Dar al-Islam would in fact conquer most of Europe, and Europe would become part of Dar al-Islam. In 732, though, in a key battle, the Franks were able to repel the Umayyads, and while they did not, conquer the Umayyads, they drove them back into what we call Spain. They called Al-Andalus. So that was a pretty significant step because it sort of marked the outer limits of the um, Dar al-Islam's imposition into Europe. But the guy that you really need to know is Charlemagne, which is French for Charles the Great. He is crowned the Holy Roman Emperor. So this is the first Holy Roman Empire, but he's crowned that title by the Pope in 800. And that's kind of significant. The Pope is the one that gives him the title of the Holy Roman Emperor. Again, unlike what is happening in the Byzantium Empire, where the emperor is essentially in control of the church, the exact opposite is true in Western Europe. The Pope grants this title to Charlemagne, who then goes out and starts conquering whatever territory he can to try to imitate that glory that was Rome in the past. For a brief moment, there is a revival of literacy and learning. The reason the Dark Ages are usually called that is because of after the fall of Rome, there's literacy and learning are not that important anymore. People are just struggling to survive, but it's temporarily revived during the reign of Charlemagne. However, this idea, this vision of a Holy Roman Empire really starts to crumble very shortly after his death. He was a strong enough figure, a charismatic enough figure that he could sort of keep it together, but his successors were not able to do the same. Shortly thereafter, then, Western Europe is under attack from all sorts of invaders. To the south, obviously, Dar al-Islam is spreading and constantly attacking all throughout. But then you've got two other groups of peoples. One, the Magyars, who they are descendants of the Huns. And in fact, to this day, what we call Hungaria, they call, or I'm sorry, what we call Hungary, they call Magyar. But they are sort of, they've tried to settle down, I guess, for a while and become civilized people, but raiding and invading is kind of in their blood, if you will. And so they're starting to raid around. But the big one is the Vikings up from the north. And we're going to look specifically at the Vikings in a couple of weeks. But the big idea here is their whole society is based on raiding anybody that they can come in contact with, and they're constantly putting pressure on all the peoples of Europe, and as we've seen, they establish some settlements in Kiev, uh, and it becomes the Rus, but nonetheless they're putting all of the pressure on Europe. Now, in response to that, because the Holy Roman Empire cannot hold it all together, feudalism will emerge as a response. The threat of constant attacks with the absence of a large centralized imperial state creates European feudalism, which is essentially a political and a social system at the same time. It's both of those functions. But the key idea, as we've seen before, is exchanging land for loyalty. Now, two terms to be familiar with: fiefs and vassals. Fiefs are the chunks of land that are granted to people in exchange for their service, sometimes referred to as fiefdoms. They're not kingdoms, they're just giant chunks of land. A vassal is anybody who owes allegiance to somebody else who gave them their fief. So fiefs and vassals become the backbone for this whole system. The basic idea here is the king would give land to the nobles in exchange for military service. Whenever the king needs an army, it's the vassals, the lords, that are supposed to give him the military support that he needs. But there's also a hierarchy, a sub-hierarchy, if you will, among the nobility. Dukes, for example, are more important than counts, than barons, etc. All of them are called lords, but they all have varying sizes of land and the prestige that goes along with that. Fiefs and titles are hereditary until the king decides to revoke them. So if you are granted a chunk of land and you get the title of duke, for example, you still have that obligation to the king over generations, but you also have the ability to pass on those lands and titles to your children into the future. The nobles, in turn, will give land to knights. And the knights, of course, are the backbone of the military force. They don't exactly have the skills to create their own farm, but they're supposed to follow a code of chivalry, a code of honor. And we'll talk more about this later on in class when we contrast it to the kind of feudalism that will emerge in Japan. But it's this code of honor that is supposed to conduct the daily lives of the knights. Both the nobles and the knights will give land to the peasants, but the giving part is questionable because in the end, the knights and the nobles own the land. They just allow the peasants to use it to farm. Most of the produce from that is given, though, to the knights and the nobles who actually own the land. And the exchange for that food that is grown from the land, though, and the service that they have to provide. In other words, the peasants have to give sons to go fight if there is a battle or a war. But the point of that is they get protection in return from the knights and from the nobles. They don't do it for nothing. They get something in return. Now, manorialism is an economic system that evolves because of the fact that everybody's afraid to travel over long distances, and so there's very little trade going on. So manorialism is the sort of economic underside of feudalism, if you will. The basic idea is that the Lord has a giant, what looks like a small city, and it's walled in, and inside that there's the Lord's castle. There's almost always a church. Outside the wall, though, is the village. That's where the commoners live. They include houses and workshops. There's always some sort of mill that the whole community can use to turn grain into flour, for example. And then outside that, you've got the agricultural fields. Now, if you look at this image, what you see in the foreground is a peasant using a till to plow the fields. You can see just behind there's some other fields there. Beyond that, there's some pasture lands. But then you see the Lord's manor in the background, the big city walls, the castle, there's a church there. So here's the basic idea. These people are living outside the walls. So imagine that you are that peasant, you're that farmer that's in the foreground there. And you're just, kind of living your life until one day, let's say, the Vikings show up and they're just all invading everybody and trying to raid and pillage everything. The idea is you go run inside the wall for protection, and then the Lord has to protect you inside those particular walls. He has to feed you until the siege is over, assuming that they can stand that long. What happens over time, though, with manorialism is the peasants, these farmers that we see in the foreground, are gradually reduced to serfs. And this is a really, really important idea here. They're giving their labor, their ability to cultivate the land, in exchange for protection. That's the fundamental idea of feudalism and manorialism in general. But over time, those peasants are literally bound to the land. And I really need you to understand this. because serfs are not exactly free people, but they're not exactly slaves either. And here's how this works. If you are bound to the land, you and your descendants are essentially a part of the landscape. And so think of it this way. If I own a territory and it has a river and a whole bunch of trees in it, let's say, if I sell that land, then the river and the trees are obviously included in that deal. That's the same way serfs work. They are literally bound to the land. They cannot move, and they are at the whimsy of whichever lord is in charge at that particular time. And that title becomes hereditary. Now, it's not quite the same as slavery, because serfs cannot be bought and sold themselves, but if the land itself changes ownership, they go with it, and they are not free to just pick up and leave and try to find some other life. Over time, then, like I said, this becomes a hereditary condition too, so that not only you, but your children and your grandchildren are all going to be bound to that same chunk of land over time. Now, in terms of religion, the development of Christianity in the West takes a very different trajectory from the one that it did in the East. The hierarchy that emerges in the West involves the Pope at the top of this hierarchy, but there's also kind of an election system, if you will. And the Pope claims his authority from St. Peter. He's the Bishop of Rome, and they claim that St. Peter himself gave his power as a disciple to the Bishop of Rome at the time, and that's how they get their authority over time. But the Pope is actually elected by the cardinals, who are elected by archbishops, who are elected by the bishops. But none of this involves any of the kings. And so the contrast to Caesaro-papism that develops in the East, in the West, the Pope gets his authority from the church itself. And then over time starts to assert that authority over all of the kings. But most significantly in the so-called Dark Ages, it's the literacy and learning that is existing at all in the West is primarily through the monks and nuns, the monasteries that are part of the church. You'll remember too, monasticism, even though it may not seem like it to us, does represent a kind of alternative to patriarchy for women. They can choose to be nuns, and that's seen as a socially acceptable option to, for example, marrying somebody that you don't want to marry or is cruel and treats you horribly. All of that building difference, though, between the East and the West obviously will culminate with the Great Schism, where Christianity is split finally into two different churches, the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church in the East. That takes us then to the High Middle Ages. And the High Middle Ages, again, from the perspective of European history, is kind of a transitional figure, because politically we start to see some changes. Whereas most of Western Europe was a feudal type system for several centuries, in Italy, for example, what we start to see is city-states emerging. These are large cities that are getting wealthy off of maritime trade in the Mediterranean. And they're trading particularly, as you'll see in the documents we're going to examine in class, with Muslims. And that gives them access to goods they might not otherwise have, but it also means they are having contact with people that they might not otherwise want to have contact with. So you got all of these city-states or smaller kingdoms. Some of them are in fact republics, starting to develop in the High Middle Ages. There's another attempt to create a Holy Roman Empire. This is in the territory that we now call Germany. It's really none of these things. and there's a constant feud. It can never really consolidate its power because the Holy Roman Emperors, uh, in the second variation of this, are constantly trying to assert their authority over the Pope, but in the end, the Pope has the authority over them, and so there's this constant struggle, power struggle, over who should be really in charge. Should it be the church or should it be the state? And then in the case of France and England, you have what are called feudal monarchies. They're essentially still a feudal structure, but over much larger territories and with one king in charge. In France, there's a dynasty established of one king who's over all of the other former kings in these smaller chunks of territories. And then in England, that's established by a Frenchman, actually, William of Normandy, who conquers all of the English estates and establishes a feudal monarchy there. Significantly, though, in 1215, which is just after the end of the High Middle Ages, King John, the King of England at the time, is forced to sign the Magna Carta. And why this is important is because the lords in England basically make the king sign an agreement saying the king cannot raise taxes unless the lords agree to it. And so what we see here is the first time that there's any sort of constraints on the king's authority. It's only the lords form parliament, and the only thing, according to the Magna Carta, they have any control over is raising taxes. But nonetheless, it's the first time that we see anything like this. So that by the end of the High Middle Ages, what we start to see is Western Europe is becoming something like what we think of Europe today. It's not so fractured, it's not so decentralized. We've got some kingdoms. Yes, we got city states. We've got large feudal kingdoms like France and England. We have the attempt at the Holy Roman Empire. It's starting to look a little bit like what we recognize as Europe. That that ties into an economic revival at the same time, particularly with agricultural production. There's all sorts of new technologies that are increasing the amount of food that can be grown on any particular plot of land. But there's also new techniques, crop rotation and the three-field system chief among them. So the three-field system originally started off as like one field went to the Lord, one field went to the church, and then the other field was for the peasants. But what have slowly emerged was this knowledge that if you just kept growing the same thing in the same field over and over, you're going to deplete the natural elements, the fertility of the soil. And so crop rotation emerged to sort of take care of that. But then they also realized if you didn't grow anything in one of those fields for a year and just sort of allowed it to replenish, you could actually increase the fertility of the soil. So the three-field system is you rotate what crops that you grow and when in a particular field, and you leave one of those three fallow every year, and you just keep rotating them. What you end up is actually creating a lot more agricultural production from the same amount of land. That has the effect, of course, when you grow more food of fueling a population growth. And so in the High Middle Ages is again a turning point that's going to culminate at the early part of the next subsection of the Middle Ages. But you can see in this, like the population growth increases dramatically in Europe at this time. That in turn will lead to urbanization. And one of the things that's different about Western Europe compared to Eastern Europe or the Byzantine Empire at the time is in Western Europe, there are very few cities, and those cities that exist are really small. They start to grow in the High Middle Ages, and so London and Paris and Toledo in Spain, I mean, they they're not still not anywhere near as large as the cities in South Asia or East Asia, but they're starting to become larger and larger. That, though, has the effect of challenging the authority of the feudal lords. If the cities are getting bigger, that means there's fewer people who are out in the countryside working as serfs to till the land for the lords. We'll come back to that in just a little bit. Finally, though, the big transition has to do with the Crusades. And the Crusades started off as an attempt to gain back the Holy Land from the Seljuk Turks, the Muslim infidels who had conquered Jerusalem. And in this map, what you see in that pinkish color are the Catholic territories. The green are the Orthodox territories, and the orange are the Muslim territories. And when the Seljuks take Jerusalem, that completely cuts off any pilgrimage to the Holy Lands for Christians. And so initially, the idea of the Crusades was to take back the Holy Lands from the Muslims, but it sort of morphs over time, and you don't need to know the individual crusades or anything like that. But what you do need to recognize is by the end of the crusades, the last crusades, they actually end up attacking Constantinople itself. And even though they are Christians, they're Orthodox Christians, and they're seen as so different from the Catholics who think that they are doing God's work here, the Crusaders actually feel justified in trying to take this over. This takes us then to the late Middle Ages, and that economic revival that starts is going to continue. Now, a big fuel for this is the Crusades. The Crusades have many effects that I can't get into too much detail right now. One of them, though, is that Western Europe becomes aware that there's a much larger world out there that has all sorts of trade, and they want to become a part of that. It sort of awakens this idea that they need to get out of manorialism and move into a long distance trade because they feel like it's going to benefit them. The other consequence of this, though, is that contact with Islamic learning, which had preserved all of those traditions from Greece and Rome, where Western Europe had forgot about them because they didn't have anything to do with Jesus, those are reintroduced back into Western Europe, which, as we'll come back to, eventually will lead to the Renaissance. That economic revival in terms of demographics continues with urbanization. That in turn leads to job specializations, and so we start to see the emergence of guilds. Now, guilds are artisan communities that basically monitor themselves. So, for example, if you're a weaver, all of the weavers get together and form a guild, and they decide everything that happens in that particular area. So, for example, how long do you have to train as an apprentice before you become a master? What are the prices of whatever you sell? How much do you pay for labor? Where do you trade it? All of these things become regulated by guilds as opposed to, say, the king or the government regulating them completely. Specialized labor in turn increases manufacturing, particularly with wool. There is a global climate shift going on called the Little Ice Age. We'll talk more about this later on. But one of the effects of that is that wool, which keeps you warm even if it's wet, becomes much more highly valued. Until then, silk was the most valuable textile, followed by cotton, both of which can keep you cool in warmer climates. But once it becomes a little bit colder, people very much value wool. Increased manufacturing then leads to increased trade. And again, that contact with the outside world becomes a part of it. The Hanseatic League is formed in Northern Europe, which is a trade agreement. It's like the first sort of free trade zone in world history in Northern Europe. All of the communities that agree to this will not tax or put tariffs on anybody else who is inside the league. It's promoting free trade. And in the south, you got the Italian merchants who are just dominating trade in the Mediterranean, even though most of them are trading with Muslims. Both of them, however, benefit from something we're going to look at next week called the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace, which has this effect that they didn't necessarily intend originally of just opening up trade all throughout Afro-Eurasia. In this map, if you look, these smaller triangles are Hanseatic towns. They're all part of the Hanseatic League. They agree that if you are a trader, a merchant from any of the other members of the league, you will not have to pay any taxes there. In the south, however, you will see that places like Milan and Venice and Florence and Genoa, they're dominating the trade in the Mediterranean. But again, this is part of a larger, like Europe is starting to expand outward at this particular time. However, at the same time, that's exposing them to things that they didn't necessarily like. About 1300 is when the plague breaks out all throughout Eurasia, not just in Europe. Pax Mongolica, as we'll see, plays a large part of this because of its fostering of these inter-regional contacts. But specifically, the proximate cause is of a particular ship that docked in Port Messina in Sicily, and it appears they were bringing the plague from the Black Sea. And from there, it's pretty easy to trace what happened. However, the fact that urbanization is increasing means that more people are living in a smaller area. They're more densely packed. They're in closer contact. That, of course, is going to help, spread the disease once it gets to Europe. Over time, 25 million or more died. That's about 1/3 of the population in Western Europe. I mean, think about that. 1 out of every 3 dies. It takes about 200 years for the population to recover in terms of demographics, but the long-term consequences are pretty significant. Come back to that in just a moment. I apologize. This is a little bit of a graphic illustration of how the Black Death works. Bubonic plague is called that because the black bulbous areas are like filled with the disease, and it happens very suddenly. The quotation at the bottom about how sudden it is, you could wake up in the morning and think everything is fine, and by the end of the night, you could be dead. This is a very interesting map for several reasons. One, because it shows how quickly this disease spread. Each of the different colors is a different year, but it also shows you how it's introduced into Europe from the Silk Roads into the Black Sea. So the dark blue is the first area, and this one particular ship sails through here, through Constantinople. So you can see it has a dramatic effect on the Byzantine Empire as well, which is just barely hanging on at the time. Sails through here, sails through, I mean, the dark blue, you can almost see the route where this ship took. It eventually ports in Messina, and then will spread into the rest of Europe. The purple is the year after that. The orange is the year after that. The yellow is the year after that. You can see how quickly this spreads. What are the consequences? All right, so look, this has a big impact on manorial economies. Like, the economy is going to change very drastically because there's just fewer farmers, serfs who are tied to the land that are living. Like, most of them are getting wiped out. And at the meantime, The labor force in the cities is also shrinking, which means that the wages for those few people who are there are going up. And so over time, people are like, man, I got to escape out of here. I know I'm kind of breaking the law, but like I could get paid way more in the city. So feudal obligations are lessened. In other words, they give them a little bit more freedom. Some were even freed completely. Nonetheless, this quotation uh, uh, signifies how like great the long-term impact. The Industrial Revolution, according to some historians, including Robert Allen, actually was sparked by the fact that the Black Death had such a huge demographic consequence in Europe. So few laborers created a situation where laborers would have to be paid more and be allowed certain freedoms that they wouldn't have otherwise had. This is an idea we'll come back to later on. So let's briefly talk about the end of the Middle Ages then. We'll come back to much of this later on. Obviously, part of this is the Renaissance. In the historiography of Europe, this is sort of the end of the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages are between the Roman Empire and the Renaissance, the rebirth of the classical learning. Much of this is fueled by the merchants of the Italian city-states. So that's why it begins in Italy. A new sort of idea emerges called humanism. We'll talk more about that later on. This is also the end of the Hundred Years' War, which of course is longer than 100 years, in which France and England have been fighting each other constantly for over a century. But one of the consequences of this is the development of new technologies. One of these is the crossbow, which has this trigger mechanism, which, as we'll see, when you combine that with the new gunpowder technologies that are just arriving at about the same time, that will form the first guns as we know them. This is also the time of the Reconquista, the reconquest of Spain, where Christians expel the Muslims out of Spain, but they also expel the Jews who had been there. And I didn't go into this in enough detail, I'm afraid, last time. But Al-Andalus, while it was a Muslim territory, also welcomed Jews who were part of the diaspora earlier in the classical period. And they contributed a great deal to the intellectual climate of Al-Andalus. Nonetheless, when the Christians, the Catholics, I should say specifically, take over, they don't just get rid of the Muslims, they also kick out the Jews as well. 1492, obviously, you'll recognize as an association with the Columbian Exchange, the discovery of the New World. All of this then leads to a new age, a new period. This is where we'll pick it up in the next unit, because what do we call this age? What is this? It's definitely something different, but is it like the culmination of everything that's happened before, or is it the beginning of something new and it's just in the earliest stages? Again, that's a question we'll come back to later. I want to thank you for paying attention. I know this has been a particularly long lesson. I apologize for that. The order of the classes for this particular year got a little bit screwed up from my perspective because of COVID, but I do thank you for paying attention, and I'll look forward to seeing you in class.